From a star who accidentally ruined his hands for models to a rabbit that cost $100,000 to save, the making of Cliffhanger was more death-defying off-camera than on. The 1993 Stallone thriller hides bizarre production secrets, impossible stunts that defied European law, and a soundtrack so similar to another movie that critics called it theft. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Cliffhanger 1993. Fact 1. Stallone's rough hands ruined his dating life. When Sylvester Stallone signed on to play mountain rescue ranger Gabe Walker in Cliffhanger, he probably didn't expect the role to interfere with his personal life in such an unexpected way. The action star's dedication to making his climbing scenes look authentic ended up creating a rather embarrassing problem that affected his relationships off-camera. During the filming of Cliffhanger in 1992, Stallone spent considerable time working with actual climbing equipment and techniques to prepare for his role as an experienced mountaineer. The process involved extensive use of climbing chalk, which rock climbers apply to their hands to improve grip on rocky surfaces. Combined with the dirt, sweat, and repeated handling of ropes and climbing gear, this preparation took a serious toll on Stallone's hands. The constant exposure to these harsh conditions caused Stallone's hands to become severely calloused and rough, transforming them from the smooth hands of a Hollywood leading man into the weathered, coarse hands of an actual mountain climber. The texture became so pronounced that it created an unexpected social problem for the star. At the time, Stallone was dating several models, as was typical for a major action movie star in the early 1990s. However, his newly roughened hands became such an issue that these women actually refused to let him touch them. The calloused, sandpaper-like texture of his skin was apparently so unpleasant that it made physical contact uncomfortable for his romantic partners. The situation became serious enough that those close to the production suggested Stallone might need to visit a beauty salon for professional hand treatments to restore his skin to its previous condition. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved that while Stallone was successfully embodying the rugged outdoorsman character of Gabe Walker on screen, this same authenticity was sabotaging his off-screen romantic encounters. This detail reveals just how committed Stallone was to the physical demands of his role, even when it meant sacrificing his personal comfort and social life. Most actors might have relied entirely on stunt doubles for the climbing sequences, but Stallone's hands-on approach to the character preparation created real consequences that extended far beyond the movie set. Fact 2. A rabbit's life cost $100,000. One of the most expensive animal welfare decisions in movie history happened during the post-production of Cliffhanger, when Sylvester Stallone personally spent $100,000 to save the life of a single rabbit that most viewers would never even notice. The story began when the filmmakers held test screenings to gauge audience reactions before the movie's final release. During these preview screenings, audiences watched a version of Cliffhanger that included a brief scene where a rabbit was accidentally killed by gunfire during one of the action sequences. The moment was likely intended to show the chaotic and dangerous nature of the shootout between the heroes and villains, demonstrating that even innocent wildlife wasn't safe from the violence unfolding in the Colorado mountains. However, the test audience reaction to this seemingly minor detail was overwhelmingly negative and surprisingly strong. Viewers expressed genuine distress and anger about the rabbit's death, with many saying it bothered them more than the human casualties in the film. The negative feedback was so intense that it threatened to overshadow the rest of the movie's reception, potentially damaging the film's commercial prospects. Faced with this unexpected problem, Stallone made a remarkable decision that demonstrated both his business sense and his concern for audience satisfaction. Rather than simply cutting the scene entirely, which might have created continuity issues, he chose to invest his own money to reshoot the sequence. The new version showed the rabbit successfully escaping the gunfire, hopping away to safety instead of being killed. The $100,000 cost covered all the expenses associated with bringing the cast and crew back together, recreating the set conditions, and filming the new footage. This amount represented a significant personal expense for Stallone, especially considering it was entirely voluntary and came out of his own pocket rather than the studio's budget. The reshooting process required careful planning to match the lighting, weather conditions, and camera angles of the original scene while ensuring the rabbit's escape looked natural and believable. The final version that audiences saw in theaters featured the small animal safely bounding away from the chaos, leaving viewers relieved rather than upset about its fate. Fact 3. The movie was never supposed to exist. Cliffhanger exists purely by accident, born from the spectacular failure of a completely different movie that was supposed to star Sylvester Stallone in an entirely different setting. The original project that brought Stallone and director Renny Harlin together was called Gale Force, and it was designed to be what industry insiders described as Die Hard in a hurricane. Gale Force would have featured Stallone playing an ex-Navy SEAL who had to battle a group of modern pirates attacking a coastal town during a massive, catastrophic hurricane. The script had been in development since 1984, when writer David Chapp first created the concept, and he spent years writing multiple drafts between 1987 and 1989. The project generated enough excitement that studios engaged in a bidding war, with Carolco Pictures eventually purchasing the final script for $500,000, plus an additional $200,000 if the movie actually got made. Renny Harlin was hired to direct Gale Force and received a $3 million pay-or-play contract, which meant he would get paid whether the movie was made or not. However, the project quickly spiraled out of control as Harlin demanded extensive rewrites to increase the number and scale of action sequences. The budget ballooned from the original $40 million to something much larger, and Carolco began to worry about the costs and technical challenges of creating realistic hurricane effects. Just 2 weeks before filming was scheduled to begin, Carolco made the dramatic decision to cancel Gale Force entirely. The studio executives decided they couldn't figure out how to create the necessary special effects for the hurricane sequences, and the budget had grown beyond what they considered manageable. However, because of Harlin's pay-or-play deal, he still received his full $3 million fee, even though the movie never happened. Rather than simply write off the loss, Carolco decided to find another project for Stallone and Harlin to work on together. They turned to Cliffhanger, which had been sitting in development with a script by Michael France based on a concept by climber John Long. Ironically, the budget for Cliffhanger ended up being $70 million, almost double what Gale Force would have cost, making the financial reasoning behind the cancellation questionable at best. Fact 4. Production shut down twice for bankruptcy. The filming of Cliffhanger turned into a financial nightmare that brought production to a complete standstill not once, but twice, when Carolco Pictures literally ran out of money and couldn't pay the cast and crew. These shutdowns created chaos on set and forced everyone involved to wait while the studio desperately searched for additional funding to keep the movie alive. Carolco Pictures was already in serious financial trouble when they began production on Cliffhanger, struggling with mounting debts that threatened the company's survival. The studio had committed to a $70 million budget for the film, but their cash flow problems meant they couldn't actually afford to make the payments required to keep production running smoothly. This created a dangerous situation where the company was essentially gambling that they could find more money before running out completely. The first shutdown occurred when Carolco simply couldn't meet payroll for the hundreds of crew members working on the film in the Italian Alps. Cast and crew members showed up to work only to be told that filming was suspended indefinitely because there was no money to pay them. This created enormous logistical problems, since the production was taking place in remote mountain locations that required expensive equipment and coordination with local authorities. During these shutdowns, the film's budget spiraled completely out of control, eventually going $40 million over the original estimate. The weather delays caused by filming in the challenging mountain environment made the situation even worse, adding 14 lost days of expensive downtime that drained the remaining funds even faster. Stallone himself was forced to make financial sacrifices to keep the movie going, reportedly giving up $2 million of his $15 million salary to help cover the costs. The desperation reached such levels that the studio had to bring in multiple additional investors, including Tristar Pictures, who eventually provided half of the film's budget in exchange for distribution rights. The complex financing arrangement that resulted from these money problems meant that even when Cliffhanger became a massive commercial success, earning $255 million worldwide, Carolco Pictures received almost nothing from the profits. The studio had traded away most of their financial stake in the film just to get it completed, making Cliffhanger a hollow victory that couldn't save the company from its eventual bankruptcy. Fact 5. Stallone was never on the mountain. Despite decades of publicity materials and interviews suggesting that Sylvester Stallone performed many of his own climbing stunts in Cliffhanger's opening sequence, actress Michelle Joyner eventually revealed the truth that completely contradicted the official story. According to Joyner, who played Sarah in the film's memorable opening scene, Stallone never actually set foot on the real mountains during the filming of that sequence, and instead performed all of his parts on a comfortable soundstage. The opening scene of Cliffhanger is widely considered one of the most intense and realistic mountain rescue sequences ever filmed, showing Stallone's character Gabe Walker attempting to save Sarah as she dangles thousands of feet above a deadly chasm. The sequence was so convincing and terrifying that audiences assumed they were watching real mountain climbing, and the studio's marketing certainly encouraged this belief by emphasizing the dangerous conditions and extreme locations. Joyner, who spent weeks filming in the actual Italian Alps above the snowline, was in a unique position to know exactly who was present during the mountain filming and who wasn't. She stated directly that everything viewers see of Stallone in that opening sequence was actually his stunt double, while all of Stallone's close-up shots and dialogue were filmed safely in a controlled studio environment. This revelation contradicted years of stories about Stallone's dedication to the role and his willingness to face his fear of heights for the sake of authenticity. Press interviews from the time featured Stallone discussing incidents where wind nearly blew him off a ladder during filming, and how he had taken on the project partly to conquer his acrophobia by playing a character who didn't share that fear. The truth was that professional climbers Ron Kauk and Wolfgang Gulich served as Stallone's principal climbing doubles throughout the film, handling all the actual mountaineering work while Stallone remained safely on the ground. An inside source even told Spy magazine at the time that Stallone was hesitant to film the mountain scenes due to both his well-documented fear of heights and a hand injury he had sustained. The seamless integration of soundstage footage with real mountain cinematography was so expertly done that even decades later, many viewers still believe they watched Stallone himself performing those death-defying stunts high above the Italian countryside. Fact 6. The 11 million stunt was illegal in Europe. One of the most spectacular stunts in Cliffhanger became the most expensive aerial stunt in movie history, precisely because European safety regulations made it completely illegal to perform anywhere on that continent. The sequence showing villain Travers climbing from one airplane to another while both planes flew at 15,000 feet couldn't be filmed in Europe due to strict aviation safety laws that required proper safety equipment for any aerial stunts. The stunt involved British stuntman Simon Crane physically transferring between two flying aircraft using only a rope and cable system, with no backup safety measures or emergency equipment of any kind. European aviation authorities considered this type of stunt far too dangerous to permit, regardless of the skill level of the performer or the experience of the pilots involved. The regulations were designed to prevent exactly this kind of high-risk aerial maneuver that put human lives in jeopardy for entertainment purposes. This legal restriction forced the production team to relocate the entire stunt sequence to the United States, where aviation laws were more flexible regarding movie stunts and allowed performers to take on greater personal risk if they chose to do so. The change in location created massive logistical challenges, requiring the coordination of multiple aircraft, specialized camera equipment, and a crew experienced in aerial cinematography. Simon Crane agreed to perform the death-defying transfer, but only after negotiating a fee of $1 million for the single stunt sequence. This astronomical payment reflected not just the extreme danger involved, but also the legal complications and location changes that had driven up the costs significantly. Crane was essentially being paid to risk his life in a way that most countries wouldn't even allow. The insurance companies involved in the production initially refused to cover the stunt, considering it too risky to insure at any price. When the insurers backed out, Sylvester Stallone made the remarkable decision to personally reduce his own salary by $1 million to cover the cost of the stunt, demonstrating just how crucial the filmmakers considered this sequence to the overall impact of the movie. The resulting footage earned Cliffhanger a place in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most expensive aerial stunt ever performed, and the sequence remains one of the most genuinely dangerous stunts ever captured on film, made possible only by the willingness of everyone involved to work outside the safety standards of most developed nations. Fact 7. John Lithgos' accent was so bad, it's famous. John Lithgos' attempt at a British accent for his villain character Eric Quaylen in Cliffhanger became so notoriously terrible that it's still discussed today as one of the worst fake accents in movie history. The accomplished American actor, who was already well established in Hollywood by 1993, decided to play the psychopathic criminal mastermind with what he believed would be an upper-class English accent, but the result was so unconvincing that it became a distraction from his otherwise solid performance. Critics and audiences immediately noticed that Lithgos' accent sounded nothing like any real British dialect, describing it as strangulated, atrocious, and cringe-inducing. British viewers were particularly harsh in their assessment, with many saying that every word Lithgow spoke made them wince. The accent was so bad that some critics suggested director Renny Harlin should have simply told Lithgow to drop it entirely and just use his natural American voice instead. What made the accent even more jarring was that Lithgow was acting alongside genuinely British actors Caroline Goodall and Craig Fairbrass, who played other members of the villain team. The contrast between their authentic accents and Lithgow's bizarre attempt highlighted just how far off the mark his pronunciation had gone. Some viewers couldn't understand why the character needed to be British at all, since the accent added nothing to the story and only served to make Lithgow's dialogue difficult to follow. The irony of this accent disaster became even more apparent years later when Lithgow delivered a masterful performance as Winston Churchill in the Netflix series The Crown. His portrayal of the famous British Prime Minister featured a completely convincing and nuanced English accent that earned him critical acclaim and awards recognition. The transformation was so dramatic that many viewers couldn't believe it was the same actor who had struggled so badly with British pronunciation in Cliffhanger. Movie discussion forums and accent analysis websites still regularly cite Lithgow's Cliffhanger performance as a prime example of how even talented actors can completely miss the mark when attempting accents outside their expertise. The performance serves as a reminder that accent work requires specialized training and practice, regardless of an actor's overall skill level, and that sometimes the safest choice is simply to stick with what sounds natural. Fact 8. The climbing equipment doesn't exist. The most criticized aspect of Cliffhanger among real rock climbers wasn't the death-defying stunts or dramatic plot, but rather a completely fictional piece of climbing equipment that violated basic physics and common sense. Throughout the movie, Stallone's character Gabe Walker uses what the film calls a bolt gun, or piton gun, that supposedly fires metal climbing anchors directly into solid rock with the pull of a trigger, creating instant anchor points for ropes and safety equipment. Real climbers immediately recognize this device as pure Hollywood fantasy, since the actual process of placing climbing anchors requires careful drilling into rock using specialized equipment, followed by the manual insertion of bolts or pitons using hammers and other tools. The idea that someone could fire a metal spike into granite or limestone with enough force to create a secure anchor point ignores fundamental properties of both rock and metal that would make such a device impossible to build. The physics problems with the bolt gun are numerous and obvious to anyone familiar with climbing equipment. The impact force required to drive a metal piton deep enough into solid rock to support a person's weight would be so tremendous that it would cause the surrounding rock to shatter and explode, sending dangerous fragments flying in all directions. Additionally, the recoil from such a device would be powerful enough to knock the user off balance or even off the cliff face entirely. Professional climbers were so annoyed by this fictional equipment that they flooded climbing magazines and online forums with complaints about the movie's technical inaccuracies. Many felt that the bolt gun misrepresented their sport and could give non-climbers completely wrong ideas about how climbing safety systems actually work. The climbing community considered it the most serious technical error in the film, more problematic than any of the exaggerated athletic feats or impossible jumps. The filmmakers created the bolt gun purely as a plot device to keep the action moving quickly without showing the time-consuming reality of proper anchor placement. In real climbing, setting up secure anchor points requires careful planning, proper technique, and several minutes of careful work, which would have slowed down the movie's pace considerably. Interestingly, the fictional bolt gun has become so associated with Cliffhanger that climbing equipment companies have occasionally created joke products or April Fool's Day announcements featuring real bolt guns, playing on the movie's lasting impact on climbing culture. Fact 9. It features the last classic Tristar logo. Cliffhanger holds a unique place in movie history as the final film to feature Tristar Pictures' original logo design, before the studio made a permanent switch to the more familiar animated version that audiences recognize today. The original Tristar logo consisted of a simple geometric Pegasus design made up of clean vector lines arranged in a triangular formation, accompanied by the studio name displayed in a basic triangular text box. This original logo design had been Tristar's corporate identity since the company's founding in the early 1980s, representing the studio's name through the visual concept of 3 stars forming the mythical winged horse. The design was minimalist and corporate in style, reflecting the graphic design trends of that era when many movie studios favored clean, geometric approaches to their branding rather than the more elaborate animated sequences that would become popular later. When Cliffhanger was released in May of 1993, moviegoers had no idea they were witnessing the end of an era in studio branding. The simple vector-lined Pegasus that appeared before the film would never be used again for any major Tristar release, making Cliffhanger an inadvertent piece of cinema history for logo enthusiasts and movie industry observers. Shortly after Cliffhanger's release, Tristar completely redesigned their opening logo to feature a fully animated sequence showing a colorful, three-dimensional Pegasus flying through realistic clouds against a sweeping sky background. This new animated logo was far more dynamic and visually impressive than the static geometric design it replaced, featuring detailed animation, dramatic music, and special effects that created a much more memorable viewing experience. The timing of this logo change reflected broader trends in the movie industry during the early 1990s, when advances in computer graphics and animation technology allowed studios to create much more sophisticated and engaging opening sequences. The old static logos suddenly seemed outdated compared to the possibilities offered by digital animation and special effects. For movie memorabilia collectors and Tristar enthusiasts, Cliffhanger represents the last opportunity to see the original logo design in its intended context at the beginning of a major theatrical release. The film serves as an unintentional time capsule, preserving a piece of studio history that was about to disappear forever as Hollywood embraced the new possibilities of digital animation. Fact 10. The composer recycled his own music. Trevor Jones found himself in the unusual position of being accused of plagiarizing his own work when he composed the soundtrack for Cliffhanger, creating music that was so similar to his previous score that critics questioned whether he had simply reused the same themes with minor modifications. The controversy centered around the striking resemblance between Cliffhanger's main theme and the memorable music Jones had created just 1 year earlier for The Last of the Mohicans. The Last of the Mohicans had featured one of the most acclaimed and popular film scores of 1992, with Jones creating sweeping orchestral themes that perfectly captured the epic scope and emotional intensity of that historical drama. The music became so associated with grand, scenic storytelling that when audiences heard Cliffhanger's soundtrack, many immediately recognized the melodic and structural similarities. Film music critic Christian Clemenson from Film Tracks specifically pointed out these similarities in his review, stating that Cliffhanger featured a title theme strikingly similar to that of Last of the Mohicans, possibly too reminiscent in fact for some listeners to tolerate. This criticism highlighted an ethical question that rarely arises in film scoring: whether a composer can borrow too heavily from their own previous work. The situation became more complicated because both films featured similar themes of survival in wilderness settings, making the musical connections seem either perfectly appropriate or lazily repetitive, depending on the listener's perspective. Some critics argued that Jones was simply drawing from the same well of inspiration that had served him so well in the previous film, while others felt that audiences deserved completely original music for their movie ticket price. Despite the controversy, Clemenson still gave the Cliffhanger score 4 out of 5 stars, acknowledging that regardless of the recycling concerns, the music worked effectively within the context of the film. He concluded that Jones's main theme for Cliffhanger stands on its own as a remarkable piece, suggesting that even borrowed inspiration could result in quality film music. The soundtrack was released twice, first through Scotti Brothers and BMG Music in May of 1993, and later in an extended version through Intrada Records in 2011, indicating that despite the criticism about originality, there was sufficient audience demand for the music to justify multiple releases over nearly 2 decades. Fact 11. 3 people claimed they wrote it. Cliffhanger became the center of a legal nightmare when 3 separate writers came forward claiming that the movie was based on their original ideas, forcing the studio into an expensive settlement to avoid delaying or canceling the film's release. Each of the 3 writers filed lawsuits, asserting that they had created the core concept of the mountain-climbing action thriller, and that the studio had stolen their work without permission or compensation. The timing of these lawsuits created enormous pressure on the production company, since legal challenges to a film's originality can potentially shut down distribution and marketing efforts completely. Studios live in constant fear of copyright infringement claims, particularly when they involve major blockbuster releases that represent millions of dollars in investment and potential profit. The threat of lengthy court battles and injunctions against the film's release made quick settlements much more attractive than fighting the cases. Rather than risk the possibility that any of the 3 writers might have legitimate claims that could jeopardize Cliffhanger's theatrical debut, the studio made the strategic decision to pay each claimant $250,000 to drop their lawsuits immediately. This settlement approach allowed the production company to move forward with their release schedule, without the uncertainty and negative publicity that would have accompanied protracted legal proceedings. The total payout of $750,000 represented a significant but manageable expense compared to the potential losses the studio would have faced if the film had been delayed or pulled from theaters entirely. Major movie releases operate on carefully planned schedules that coordinate with marketing campaigns, theater bookings, and seasonal audience expectations, making any disruption extremely costly. The fact that 3 different writers independently claimed ownership of the same basic story concept suggests either remarkable coincidence or the possibility that the mountain rescue thriller premise was considered an obvious and appealing idea for an action movie. Hollywood has a long history of similar concepts being developed simultaneously by different writers who have no contact with each other, leading to disputes over who deserves credit for ideas that may have occurred to multiple people. The settlements allowed Cliffhanger to proceed to its planned release date without any admission of wrongdoing by the studio, and the film went on to become a major commercial success that easily recouped the settlement costs along with its substantial production budget. Fact 12. The money props make no sense. The central plot device of Cliffhanger revolves around stolen money that couldn't possibly exist in the form shown, creating a series of logical problems that make the entire heist scenario completely impossible in real life. The film depicts the villains stealing briefcases full of freshly printed $1,000 bills from the Denver Mint, but this scenario contains multiple factual errors that anyone familiar with American currency production would immediately notice. The first major problem is that $1,000 bills were officially discontinued by the United States government in 1969, more than 20 years before the events of Cliffhanger supposedly took place. While some of these high-denomination bills still exist in private collections and banks, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing stopped producing them decades ago, making it impossible for any government facility to have briefcases full of freshly printed $1,000 bills in the 1990s. The second, and even more glaring error, involves the location where this money was supposedly being produced. The film specifically identifies the Denver Mint as the source of the stolen currency. But the Denver Mint exclusively produces coins and has never been involved in paper money production. All United States paper currency is printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which operates facilities in Washington, D.C. and Fort Worth, Texas, but has no connection to any of the various mint locations around the country. If the Denver Mint had actually been producing $100 million worth of currency, and that currency had been in the form of coins as it should have been, the weight would have made the entire heist plot absurd. $100 million in quarters, which would be the most reasonable high-value coin for such a scenario, would weigh approximately 5 million pounds, requiring a massive cargo aircraft and industrial lifting equipment rather than the small briefcases shown in the movie. The filmmakers apparently chose the Denver location because it sounded more dramatic and remote than the actual Bureau of Engraving and Printing facilities, and they selected the discontinued $1,000 denomination because it allowed them to fit large amounts of money into reasonably sized briefcases. However, these creative choices created a scenario that anyone with basic knowledge of American currency would recognize as completely fictional, undermining the realistic tone the movie was trying to establish in other areas. Fact 13. A legendary climber died before release. One of the most tragic stories connected to Cliffhanger involves Wolfgang Gulick, a legendary German rock climber who served as Sylvester Stallone's climbing double during production, but never lived to see the finished film that showcased his incredible skills. Gulick was widely regarded as one of the most fearless and accomplished climbers of his generation, known for pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible in the sport of rock climbing. Gulick's reputation in the climbing world made him the perfect choice to handle the most dangerous and technically demanding climbing sequences in the movie, performing stunts that required not just physical strength and agility but also years of experience with advanced climbing techniques. His involvement in the film represented a rare opportunity for mainstream audiences to witness the skills of a true master of the sport, even if they didn't realize they were watching one of climbing's greatest athletes. The tragedy occurred approximately 9 months after filming had been completed, but before Cliffhanger reached theaters. Gulick was driving on the Autobahn, the German highway system, somewhere between the cities of Munich and Nuremberg, when he apparently fell asleep at the wheel. His car veered off the highway, resulting in a serious crash that left him critically injured. Gulick was rushed to a hospital where medical staff fought to save his life, but his injuries proved too severe. He died 2 days after the accident, cutting short the life of an athlete who had dedicated himself to conquering some of the world's most challenging rock faces and inspiring countless other climbers to push their own limits. The filmmakers chose to dedicate Cliffhanger to Gulick's memory, ensuring that his contribution to the movie would be permanently recognized and that audiences would know about the real person behind some of the film's most spectacular climbing sequences. The dedication serves as a reminder of the real risks that professional climbers face, both in their sport and in everyday life. Gulick's death also highlighted the dangers of drowsy driving, a problem that affects drivers worldwide. His story became a somber reminder for people everywhere about the importance of pulling over and resting when they feel tired behind the wheel, rather than trying to push through fatigue that can have deadly consequences. Act 14. The Finnish flag appears in a parachute. Director Renny Harlin secretly paid tribute to his homeland by incorporating the distinctive blue and white design of the Finnish flag into one of Cliffhanger's most dramatic action sequences, continuing a personal tradition of sneaking references to Finland into his Hollywood movies. The tribute appears during the base-jumping escape scene, where one of the characters uses a parachute that features the exact color pattern and cross design of Finland's national flag. Harlin, who was born and raised in Finland before making his way to Hollywood, had developed a habit of including subtle nods to his native country in the films he directed. These references served as personal signatures that connected him to his roots while working in the American movie industry, though they were usually so subtle that only the most observant viewers or those specifically looking for Finnish connections would notice them. The Finnish flag features a distinctive design with a blue Nordic cross on a white background, representing the country's lakes and snow-covered landscape. This pattern is quite recognizable to anyone familiar with Scandinavian flags, but most American audiences would simply see it as an interesting color scheme for a parachute without realizing its national significance. The base-jumping sequence itself was one of the film's most visually striking moments, showing a character escaping from the villains by leaping off a cliff and deploying a parachute to glide to safety. The dramatic nature of the scene meant that the parachute would be prominently displayed on screen for several seconds, giving Harlin's Finnish flag tribute maximum visibility within the context of the movie. This type of personal touch reflects the creative freedom that successful directors often enjoy when working on major studio productions, allowing them to include small details that have personal meaning without affecting the overall story or commercial appeal of the film. The Finnish flag parachute represented Harlin's way of maintaining a connection to his cultural identity while directing an quintessentially American action movie. For Finnish audiences who spotted this Easter egg, the flag reference likely created a moment of national pride and connection to see their country's symbol featured so prominently in a major Hollywood blockbuster, even if the reference was entirely coincidental to the plot and characters of Cliffhanger. Fact 15. It originally earned an NC-17 rating. The version of Cliffhanger that audiences saw in theaters was significantly toned down from what director Renny Harlin originally filmed after the Motion Picture Association of America initially gave the movie an NC-17 rating for extreme violence that was considered too graphic for general audiences. This rating would have been a commercial disaster for the studio, since most theaters refuse to show NC-17 films and many newspapers won't run advertisements for them. The original cut of Cliffhanger contained much more graphic and prolonged depictions of violence, particularly during the airplane hijacking sequence where Treasury agents are killed by the criminals. In the NC-17 version, when an agent was shot twice in the chest, the film showed extended slow-motion footage of the bullet's impact, allowing viewers to see the character's physical reaction to being hit in disturbing detail that the ratings board found excessive. Another scene that contributed to the harsh rating involved an agent being shot in the head, with the original footage showing blood and brain matter splattering across the wall behind the victim in graphic detail. The theatrical version that eventually reached audiences only briefly showed the aftermath of this violence, cutting away before viewers could see the full extent of the gore. The studio executives faced enormous pressure to bring the film down to an R rating, which would allow it to reach the broad audience necessary for a major summer blockbuster. This required careful editing to remove the most graphic moments while preserving the intensity and impact of the action sequences that were central to the movie's appeal. The editing process involved cutting several seconds of slow-motion violence and reducing the amount of visible blood and gore throughout the film, particularly during scenes where characters were shot or killed. These changes were substantial enough that some scenes had to be re-edited multiple times to satisfy the ratings board while maintaining narrative coherence. The NC-17 rating controversy reflected broader debates about violence in Hollywood movies during the early 1990s, when action films were becoming increasingly graphic and realistic in their depiction of gunfights and physical combat. Cliffhanger's experience demonstrated the ongoing tension between filmmakers who wanted to create visceral, realistic action sequences and the commercial necessity of achieving ratings that would allow wide theatrical distribution.